Welcome to my presentation, Thinking Through Challenges, Using Critical Thinking to Teach Symbolism. So what is critical thinking? Critical thinking, according to dictionary.com, defines critical thinking as disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. Today in my presentation, we're going to focus on what's rational and what's open-minded through examples. So what does the research say? We're going to talk about critical thinking versus comprehension. Now, in reading an article by a lady named Jen Walters, her article talked about how when you are applying critical thinking in the classroom, we have to be very careful with knowing the difference between critical thinking and just plain old comprehension. So when you're planning activities where you want your students to think critically, you have to think of questions that would have the children to be challenged in ways that they can apply what they're learning or do extensive research or things of that nature. Just comprehension means, can you repeat back the facts? So when you are thinking of critical thinking, it cannot be comprehension, and you have to be very careful with that. And one way to prevent that from happening is pre-teach using comprehension. So have the children become familiar with the material that you're going to teach so that they can recall the facts that happen in a particular piece that you are presenting to the children. But when you're challenging them with a task for critical thinking, they can use what they've comprehended in order to think critically and apply their knowledge somewhere else, but not just regurgitate the facts that they had just learned. So what does critical thinking look like? I've chosen 5 things. Application. So you want them to be able to apply what they're learning, as mentioned in the previous slide. So if there's no application going on, they are not thinking clearly. So it's got to go into the higher order thinking time. In order to carry out an effective critical thinking task, you need to have time. So you need to make sure that time is planned with your lesson. Frustration. So I chose this funny picture of a child being frustrated because, there is going to be some frustration if your critical thinking is providing a challenge for your children. You do have to find a balance between frustration and a challenge, because we have children today that, of course, will give up on the slightest bit of challenge. So you do want them to be challenged, but you do not want to set up your critical thinking tasks to the point where the children cannot execute any portion of it because it's too hard. So make sure we're not just thinking of hard when we're thinking of critical thinking. Here is a big one, making connections. So the whole point of critical thinking, and really any lessons that should be planned by any teacher today, is for your children to be able to make a connection to what they're learning, to real world situations. So again, as mentioned for the child here before, with frustration, you do not want it just to be hard. You want it to be challenging, but segmented or put in steps in a way that the children can actually apply what they're learning and to be able to make a relationship to their everyday life or their future plans or things that they have experienced so that they can commit whatever they're learning to permanent knowledge. And working together. So a critical thinking task, especially if it's a group activity, should be planned in such a way where the children are engaged. All of them are engaged, whether you're separating their jobs, whether they're working together to solve something. But you do have to make sure that you have planned in such a way that the children all can have a part in what they're learning. So the next portion I'm going to show you is a critical thinking task that I was able to observe with a teacher in a class of students at my school. So this task was, the assignment and the standard was to understand and apply symbolism. And this teacher used the book reference, I Never Saw Another Butterfly. A little background on this book. This book is a series of poems written by children that were in the Terezin concentration camp during World War II. This was a deeply moving activity for the children. The children were currently working and learning on World War II, and they were going to apply the idea of symbolism with it. So here's a student sample. So basically, all the children were given a poem written by a child, and their job was to read the poem and to identify important portions of the poem and decorate a butterfly using symbols to represent what the child said. So here's a student sample of a butterfly. Now, this student had a child that wrote this poem, and some of the symbols that the child chose to represent the kid's poem that was read was the earth being cut off from the world, because the child mentioned that they felt like this concentration camp was cut off to the free world, and a boot, because they said, and a boot is actually moving, because the child said to me that the child in the poem stated that they could not outrun what was going on and death. They could not outrun death. So that's the symbolism of the boot. In the sun, of course, that's the child's name who wrote the poem. And the student also made an eye, and his interpretation, although he did not include it in his writing sample, was that this is the vision of the kid, that the child wished and remembered and hoped to see a beautiful day from where they lived and in their life. So, how did it all end? So, it ends with the children, after they've decorated their butterfly and interpreted the symbols that they've chosen. They had a survivors and a memoriam board outside in the hallway. And the children found out at the end, after they did their constructive responses and made their butterflies, they found out whether their child lived and survived. And there was a very, very big purpose to that. So I'm going to show you here that here were the children that actually survived that concentration camp of the poems that were read, in comparison to how many of those children actually died. Now, how can I apply this to World War II? Well, as mentioned before, when we're talking about critical thinking, you're trying to have the children to make connections. So here's the biggest connection. The children hear, when they're learning in the classroom, of the millions of people that died during the Holocaust. But to a child of fifth grade age, when you tell them millions or almost a whole generation, what they attempted to wipe out a whole generation, it's very hard for them to understand the amount of people in that particular race were wiped out. So this picture and the picture before are right across from each other. And the children were able to actually understand what those numbers were when it came to how many children, in this case, and people actually died. And that concludes my presentation.